Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're talking about how a saint becomes a saint. Let's begin. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the communion of saints. In our last episode, we talked about what is a saint and how do we as Catholics respond to them? Do we worship them? No. But we do want to imitate them. We do ask for their intercession. This episode is going to talk about how you get there. So if we said last time, a saint is anybody who's in heaven, but that the people who we call saint, like Saint Joseph, Saint Francis, they've been canonized. They have been officially recognized by the church as being saints. So today we're going to talk about what that process looks like. How does the church recognize somebody who's in heaven? So if you have taken my church course, especially sophomores and juniors, you should remember this. We talked about these 4 steps. Today we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So this is going to be kind of a more in-depth look at the canonization process. We're going to be mentioning some things that we just didn't have time to talk about. So bonus point. Before I begin, I want to say thank you to all of you for listening. As always, I'm blown away by how, I don't want to say how popular this is, but just by how many people are still listening. Here we are in episode 13. So thank you so much for sticking with us. If you are just jumping in, and this is the first episode of Bonus Points you've listened to, welcome. That's great. These episodes aren't always connected. This one is kind of connected to the last one, but I try to make them as standalone as possible so that you can find the topics that interest you, listen to those ones, and just kind of ignore the rest. So, one request I have of you before we dive in, I'm hoping to do another episode of Question and Astel soon, maybe even our next episode. So if you have any questions you'd like me to talk about on the show, let me know. Head on over to bonuspointspodcast.com and you can click Submit a Question for our next Question and Astel. Okay, so we have these saints, right? These people who are in heaven. We have some who the church has officially recognized as being in heaven, what we call canonized saints. Why have a process for that? Like, why? There wasn't always a process. It used to just, it would kind of happen very organically. So some saints, like I mentioned Saint Joseph, he never had a canonization process. He just was always venerated. Devotion grew and grew and has always been with the church. Nowadays, there's a very specific process that must be followed before the church will recognize somebody as a saint. Why is that? Well, remember the point of canonization is to say that person's in heaven. And so we should make sure they're in heaven, right? Somebody may have seemed to some people to be exceptionally virtuous, but not everybody knew them. So it's important for the church to take some time to investigate their lives, to make sure, like, were they actually as virtuous as people thought they were? We want to see proof of that. That's also going to give time for them to give the potential saint an opportunity to prove that they can intercede for us, and that's where miracles come in. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Anyway, the whole process of canonization begins when somebody dies. The person who may be declared a saint someday, you can't be a saint and be alive, at least not alive in this world, because by definition, you got to be in heaven. So from the time a person dies, the church mandates a 5-year waiting period before anything else before the process can start. You got to wait 5 years. Now that can be waived occasionally. Pope Benedict waived all 5 years of Pope St. John Paul II's waiting period. JP2, when he was Pope, had waived 3 of the 5 years for Mother Teresa. So it's not always a strict rule. It's possible that you can waive that, but typically there's a 5-year waiting period. That gives time to establish whether they have an enduring reputation for sanctity. Because, there are some people who, they're very popular, they're popularly seen as holy, but then they kind of fade out of the picture, and in a few years, nobody really cares. So This gives an opportunity to see, do they have an enduring reputation for sanctity? That gives time for maybe any skeletons to fall out of any closets. And that's also part of the investigation process. Is there anything we should know about this person? Anyway, after that waiting period, somebody, either a person or a group, will go to the bishop of the person's diocese and will ask him to open a cause. Now, if they were part of a religious order, it's probably going to be that religious order that does it. Could just be somebody who knew them. So somebody will go to the bishop. They'll explain to him why they think this person should be canonized. And at this point, if the bishop seems to be going along, he says, okay, yeah, I could see this. He's going to write to Rome, to the Curia in Rome, and he's communicating his intent to open a cause for canonization. All the parts of the Curia have a chance to object if they want to object. But assuming they don't, they send back what's called a nihil obstat, which means nothing hinders or nothing is stopping this. That's not really permission at this point. The bishop just checks with Rome to say, hey, you guys have a problem with this? And the nihil obstat is them saying, no, go ahead. It's definitely not like an endorsement or again, permission. It's more of them saying, yeah, we don't see any reason to tell you to stop. So at this point, the bishop will officially open the cause for beatification and canonization. And at this point, the person is now known as a servant of God. At this point, the diocese, or maybe the religious order, will establish a postulation, which is a group that leads an investigation into the life of the servant of God. This group is led by somebody called a postulator, who's kind of in charge at this point. He's the guy who's kind of keeping this process moving. So what will this postulation do? They will interview witnesses. They'll find people who knew this person. They will get them to give testimony about the person's life, about their character. They'll collect any other important documents related to the servant of God, especially their writings. Anything that person wrote, either publicly or privately, they're going to collect, they're going to go through that. Sometimes this phase of collecting documentation can last for years, depending how much writing there was, how hard it is to find the documents. This can take a long, long, long time. Eventually, all of this evidence is examined by a diocesan tribunal, diocesan court, and assuming they approve it, the bishop looks at it. The question that they're asking is, did this servant of God demonstrate heroic virtue? Because, obviously we should all be virtuous, right? But what sets the saints apart, like we talked about last time, I think, is that they had heroic virtue. They lived the virtues to a heroic degree. That's what this investigation is looking for. Not just, were they a good guy? Were they okay? Were they pretty nice? We're looking for their virtue to say, was it to a heroic degree? If the tribunal and if the bishops say yes, at this point, they'll take all that evidence, they'll compile it into a volume called an acta. I think that's how you say it, acta. They're acts, and they're going to send that to a particular group in Rome that at this exact moment is called the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Once the Curia's new constitution comes into effect in July, they're going to be called the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints. I'm going to keep calling them the Congregation because that's what they're called right now, and that's what I'm more used to, and that's honestly what I like more. Anyway, the Congregation, again, Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome, will appoint a relator at this point. That's kind of like a postulator, but from the Vatican side, from the Roman side. They're the one they work for the congregation. They're going to guide the process from here. So the relator is going to compile what's called a positio, which is a summary of all the evidence from the Acts. So they're going to look through all that, and they're going to summarize. They're going to write a document that gives what the person's, basically a biography of the person, and a summary of what evidence is there. There's a Theological Commission, a group of theologians in the congregation that's going to evaluate that positio and vote on whether they think that this person demonstrates heroic virtue. If they say yes, then all the members of the congregation who are bishops or cardinals are going to vote on it. Same question. Does this demonstrate heroic virtue? If they say yes, the congregation is now going to write to the Pope, and they're writing a recommendation that he makes what's called a decree of heroic virtue. Basically, they're asking the Pope to declare that this servant of God lived a life of heroic virtue. If he agrees, at this point, the servant of God is now called venerable. So either just venerable, like Venerable Fulton Sheen, or the full name, we could call them Venerable Servant of God. But either way, at this point, the church has investigated their life. The church has declared that this person lived a life of heroic virtue, but we don't know for sure whether they're in heaven yet. Or at least we're still looking for evidence that they're interceding for us. And so at this point, we wait for a miracle. So after the break, we'll talk about how those miracle claims are evaluated, how they are vetted, and then we'll talk about what happens there. What's the difference? Like how do things look different for a blessed than for a venerable? Until then, I'll see you in a few seconds. Welcome back. Before the break, I said that in order to prove or look for evidence that the person is in heaven, we wait for a miracle. What does that mean? So first of all, a lot of misconceptions in this area. People often assume that when we say that you need a miracle to be canonized, they mean that you need to have performed a miracle during your life, which is not necessarily true. If that did happen, that would certainly be part of the acts that are compiled. But when we say that a miracle is required for canonization, we're talking about a miracle that is performed through your intercession after you've died. So why do we do this? Well, because that would be pretty clear evidence that you're in heaven, right? Because like we said in the last episode, we ask the saints to pray for us. We ask them to intercede for us. And so if I ask somebody who I think is in heaven, somebody who's a servant of God, who's a venerable, if I ask them to pray for me for a miracle to happen, and then this miracle happens, all right, that's pretty clear evidence that God is listening to them, which means they're in heaven and they're interceding for us. So we ask for a miracle because that's going to be some pretty clear evidence that that person is able to intercede for us, and therefore they're in heaven. So once somebody experiences what they think was a miracle, that they think was that saint's intercession or that person's intercession, they're going to start an investigation. Now, technically, this can be any kind of miracle, but in 99.9% of the cases, it's going to be some sort of miraculous healing or other sort of medical miracle. And part of the reason for that is because of how clear-cut the investigation can be, not is, compared to other types of miracles that are a lot harder to investigate for the congregation. So, the first thing that's going to happen when you think you've experienced a miracle, the bishop of the diocese where the miracle occurred is going to open an investigation. This investigation is going to pretty much have two parts. So, we want to be careful. Why do we investigate a miracle? It's a miracle, right? We want to make sure it actually was. Because if it was just something that was natural, maybe there was an unknown natural explanation for what happened, we wouldn't want to call that a miracle, especially in this case, for two reasons. Number one, we'd be using it as evidence for something that it's not evidence for. That doesn't prove the person's, that has nothing to do with the venerable who was interceding, possibly. So we don't want to use something as evidence that's not necessarily evidence. But, and this might even be the more important one, it would cause scandal. It would make the church look ridiculous if we're out here calling something a miracle that was not. So we want to be sure that what we're calling a miracle is actually a miracle. And so the diocese will put together two courts, two tribunals, one theological and one scientific. So let's start with what will the scientific tribunal do? Their job is to investigate to determine whether this event, this so-called miracle, had any kind of natural explanation. That's part of why it's typically healings, because doctors can look at it and they can say, yeah, there's no natural way that could have happened. We want to establish that it didn't happen on its own, that it wasn't just, oh yeah, it kind of went away by its own effect, by its own power. We want to make sure that it wasn't just an effect of any sort of medication that the person was taking. Again, you could say that the medicine, the treatment working is a miracle in the sense that it is something great that God has done, but it's not the kind of miracle we're looking for here. We want something that is clearly supernatural, that can only be ascribed to God's power. So we have to establish that there's no natural explanation and that it didn't happen on its own or through because of the medication or the treatment. So the clearest cases, this is what the congregation loves to see. When you have a situation that was beyond medical hope, that is cured instantaneously, either from one moment to the next or sometimes from one day to the next, in a way that cannot be explained by the medicine that was used. Especially, and this is like, when they see this, they smile because their job just got easier. When you have cases where there was some sort of instantaneous diseased tissue or even missing tissue, damaged tissue that was restored, or you had some sort of malignancy that just disappears. The stories of the people who maybe have cancer and it's been spreading, and then they go from one day to the next and the doctor examines them and it's totally gone. That's the kind of clear-cut miracle that makes it a lot easier to investigate. So the Scientific Commission at the diocese is going to look and say, is this something that has no possible natural explanation? Not even just a known natural explanation. They want to rule out, is it possible that there's a natural cause that we just aren't thinking of or that we aren't aware of? But assuming there isn't, they'll say, okay, there is no scientific, natural explanation for what happened here. On the other side, the Theological Commission is going to investigate whether it was a miracle in the strictest sense of the word, meaning, is it something that was only through God's power? And that's going to be very similar to what the Scientific Tribunal is doing. They want those clear cases. They want to make sure that it wasn't something else. The fact that it's instantaneous is helpful for the Theological Tribunal because that would rule out angelic or demonic origin. And you might say, hold on, back up. Did you just say angelic or demonic? So in theory, it would be possible, I don't know how likely it is, but it's possible, that a disease was caused by a demon. And then the demon just stopped causing it. They withdrew their activity. And so the person would naturally get better. But that wouldn't be instantaneous. So that's why the tribunal would love to see an instant cure or a day-to-day cure, because that would be clearer evidence that it is God's action and not something else, even something else supernatural. So the other question that the Theological Tribunal will have to consider, did this happen through the intercession of the venerable? Again, they want something clear-cut here. If you have a person who's experienced this miraculous healing and they'd been praying to this venerable, asking for their intercession, they'd been asking all of their friends and family to do the same, and then they're healed, all right, that's pretty good. If the person says, well, I was asking for that venerable's intercession, but also this saint and Our Lady, and okay, it's not a deal breaker, but it is a little bit less clear, because remember, the whole point is we're trying to prove that this venerable is in heaven and able to intercede. If there's a case where, it almost becomes a whodunit, like how do we know that it was their intercession and not one of these other saints? So there are, the cause of the saint, the group that's trying to get this person canonized, will often ask people to pray for that servant of God, that venerable's intercession, and to say, here's a prayer for their canonization, pray for their intercession. If something happens, like make sure you were praying them, because we want to see you healed, but we want to see this cause move forward. So they'll encourage people, please, please, please pray for his intercession so that we give him the chance to work a miracle, right? So at this point, if both of those tribunals, both the theological and the scientific, agree that it was miraculous and that it was a miracle that was that came from the intercession of that venerable, they will pass it on to the bishop for his approval. If everybody checks off on it at that point, they will send it to the congregation in Rome, who will now do their own investigation. The congregation in Rome will also set up a theological and a scientific tribunal that will examine the findings of those diocesan tribunals to basically to evaluate, did they do their job right? Was the investigation done well? Does the evidence support the conclusion? Assuming both of those tribunals agree that this was a miracle, that it was a miracle through the intercession of that venerable, just like before, all the bishops of the congregation will vote. If that gets passed, the congregation will give it to the Pope, and they will request that he make a decree of a miracle. So just like before, where you have the different parts of the congregation vote on it, and then they give it to the Pope, and they make a request that he makes the decree. Because at the end of the day, it is his job, really, to do this, to officially declare this. So they will recommend it. I imagine in most cases, a pope is going to trust his congregation that they've done their job right. And so if they make that request for a decree of a miracle, he's likely to approve it. Again, he's kind of trusting they did their job right. That's why they exist. Now, if the person died as a martyr, if they were somebody who was killed for the faith, specifically killed in odium fidei or in hatred of the faith, sometimes the requirement for a miracle at this stage can be waived, with the understanding, the logic there is martyrdom is its own miracle, right? Somebody dying for the faith is a miracle of grace. That's not something that we can do through our own human ability. So if you have somebody who dies in hatred of the faith, you can, instead of having a decree of a miracle at this stage, the Pope can issue a decree of martyrdom, which will they'll take the place of the miracle. So once you have that decree, either a decree of a miracle or a decree of martyrdom, at this point, the venerable can be beatified. At this point, now there's some ceremony involved. You have what's called the rite of beatification. Usually, this is done in the place that the soon-to-be blessed was from, and usually it is celebrated by the prefect, the head of the congregation for the causes of saints, although sometimes popes do it themselves as well, depending on who it is. So at this stage, the venerable is now known as blessed. This is where things really start to get exciting. What's different at this stage? Well, we're still not sure they're in heaven. We're still not certain. The Pope has not acted infallibly. The Church itself has not acted infallibly to say that they're in heaven. But we're more sure that we have at least one miraculous event to their credit. So once they're blessed, the Church is now comfortable saying that they can be given some level of public veneration. What does this mean? Public veneration means, a good rule of thumb is in the name of the Church. So if you, as a private person, wanted to venerate this servant of God, this venerable, you could do that. You could even get a group together and say, we're going to pray for his intercession, or we're going to celebrate his life. We're going to have a prayer group asking for his intercession. You could do that. You could even do that in the parish building, as long as it's not the parish, it's you. You're the one doing this. This is a private event, even if it is held in public and is open to everybody. The Church itself does not offer public veneration until they reach this blessed stage. So, for example, up until this point, you couldn't celebrate Mass for a venerable's feast day because they don't have one yet. You can't add their name to the Eucharistic prayer where it has that section where you can add in saint names. You can't put his name there. You can't put up his picture or a statue of him in a church. Like you can't put his picture next to St. Peter. You can't name a church after him yet. Once they're blessed, once they reach that stage, you can do things like that. You can have that public veneration in specific areas. Not the universal church quite yet, but in any area or group that had a connection to them. So, for example, when Pope St. John Paul II was beatified, the Congregation for the Congregation for Divine Worship basically said that you can publicly venerate this blessed. You can celebrate their feast day with a mass. You can celebrate their feast day in the divine office. You can name a church after him in Rome because he was the Pope, and in Poland because he was Polish. If you had for example, a Franciscan blessed, they might say, okay, Franciscans can celebrate his feast day, but we're not yet going to celebrate it universally. Now, other groups might then petition the Congregation for Divine Worship. They might ask for what's called an indult to say, hey, I know that JP2 was from Poland and not Denver, but he did come to visit Denver back in the 90s, and we have a really strong devotion to him because of that. They might ask for permission to also publicly venerate him, and it's going to be up to the Congregation for Divine Worship to decide whether that happens. But the reason for this, again, we're pretty sure they're in heaven at this stage, and so we are comfortable giving them some public veneration, but the Universal Church hasn't declared it yet, and so the Universal Church isn't going to venerate them. So, how do you get from blessed to saint? Because that's the last step, right? If you're blessed, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to be canonized to become a saint, to be declared a saint. I'm going to say becoming a saint. What I really mean here is to be declared a saint, because it's not the church that makes you a saint when they canonize you. All that does is it declares on earth what was already true in heaven. A canonization declares on earth what was already true in heaven, that you're there. So, how do you get the church to do that? At this point, a second miracle is needed. Again, because we want to be sure. We want to know that it was through their intercession. So, once there's a second miracle, that is going to follow the whole procedure, the same as the first one, in terms of investigating it, making sure that it's legit. Assuming that a second decree of a miracle is approved, or you had a decree of martyrdom, now you have a decree of miracle. Assuming both of those are approved, all the obstacles are out of the way, the Pope can decide to canonize you. So that's done. That's always done by the Pope in what's called a Rite of Canonization. Sometimes it happens in Rome, usually it's if the Pope is in Rome, but occasionally he'll save canonizations for when he's on one of his apostolic journeys, and he'll canonize the person in their area. So, for example, when Pope Francis came to the U.S. back in, what was it, 2015? He canonized Saint Junipero Serra, who was an American saint. He founded a lot of missions along the West Coast. Pope Francis performed the rite of canonization here, but most saints are canonized from Rome. So what this ceremony does is it declares that we now can be confident to say as a church that this person is in heaven. Most people, although not all, most people consider this to be an infallible act of the church, so that if the church has canonized a saint, we can trust without doubt that that person is definitely in heaven. There are others who would disagree with that, and that might be a good topic for a future episode. Are canonizations infallible? But for our purposes right now, we'll say, if somebody's been canonized as a saint, me, you, us ordinary faithful, we should have no qualms venerating them. So at this point, you can celebrate this saint, you can venerate them publicly in the name of the church anywhere in the world. If they think that this saint has a particularly universal appeal, they might add their feast day to the universal calendar so that it's celebrated everywhere, either as an optional memorial or as an obligatory memorial. But even if it's not added to the general calendar, that saint can still be celebrated through a votive mass anywhere. All right, so all that, and I'm not keeping track closely, but I think this might be one of our longer episodes. So sorry if you didn't like that, and you're welcome if you did. Anyway, either way, what are our takeaways here? What's the point? Why should you care about this? Well, we have a process because we want to make sure that somebody actually was virtuous before we tell people to imitate them. If we said in the last episode that we imitate the saints, we live like them, the church wants to make sure that the person actually is a good role model before we tell people to do that. The second reason, if we're going to ask them to intercede for us, we want to make sure they're actually in heaven, right? The church doesn't want to tell you to ask somebody for intercession if they're not actually able to do that. So this whole process connects back to what we said in the last episode. What is our relationship with the saints? We venerate them. We want to imitate them. This process guarantees that that's a good idea in a particular case. So that's all we really have for today. Our next episode in the Communion of Saints series is going to be about relics. I'm super excited because it's one of those cool topics that there's so much you could say. We're going to talk about how to make a relic, not like how to forge a relic. How do you go from, like, during this process, they're creating relics of that soon-to-be saint. How does that happen? So this is the part where I tell you to like and subscribe. But I'm going to be honest, I don't really know what like means in this context. If you're listening to this on Spotify or most other podcast platforms, I don't know that you can like an episode. But do subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next one. I'm not sure whether the next episode will be another question and astel or the relic episode. Those are both coming up soon. So if you can, and that makes sense, like and subscribe. But the most important thing you can do is share this, pass it along, tell people about the show. If there's an episode that you think somebody would enjoy, send it to them. Remember, you don't have to listen to these in any kind of order. If the topic seems interesting, pass it along. Make sure you check out our website, bonuspointspodcast.com, and submit a question for our next episode of Question and Astel. In terms of resources that I will have in the show notes for this time, I'm linking to a fantastic article. I found it on EWTN. I don't know if they wrote it or not, but it goes through the entire process in really good detail. That was the basis. That was most of my research. I'm also going to attach an article that's a little bit shorter and simpler. It breaks it just down into these 4 steps. If you took my church course, that you'll remember that that's the article that we used in class. I'm going to be linking for the website for the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, soon to be known as the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints, and a page on the USCCB's website that gives a really good glossary of some of these terms I've used, like positio and other ones that I don't remember what all's on there. But a lot of those words that we threw around here that maybe you aren't as familiar with, they have a really good glossary there. So make sure you check those out. Until next time, have a fantastic rest of your day. My name is Mr. Astel, as it was at the beginning of the show, and you are listening to Bonus Points.